But as Jonah is in this dialogue with God in chapter 4, and God is rebuking Jonah because he doesn't appear to have any compassion on the people of Nineveh. Perhaps what this book really was meant to do in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, in that post-exilic setting, was to help Israel understand something they had not understood before. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Dr. Jeff Rankin, the Acting Dean of the College of Christian Studies at North Greenville University. Today we're beginning a series on the Old Testament prophet Jonah. As we begin that series, we want to take just a moment to set the context for Jonah, a little bit of background on Jonah himself, and then of course on the prophets. In terms of the canon, we find Jonah in what's called the 12 minor prophets, or sometimes just referred to as the 12. Jonah falls in that position as the fifth among these 5 minor prophets. One of the questions that's been asked about the 12 is how they're arranged, and really there's not a clear answer to that question. There's been a suggestion that perhaps there are key words that end each of the minor 12 prophets' books, and that the editors were working off of those key words to place the next prophet in position. Also, there's been the suggestion that chronology does not play a role at all, and I think we can see that pretty clearly in that the prophet preceding Jonah, Obadiah, is actually dealing with clearly a post-exilic or exilic setting where he's describing the fall of Jerusalem and what had happened there, and Jonah is set in a very different time. And so there's some questions about how to understand the 12 minor prophets. One interesting note about the 12 is when you combine all 12 in terms of length, we have just really one scroll that would be necessary to encompass all 12 books. That's probably the reason they've been referred to as the minor prophets. Not that they're less important, but that they're just smaller books. And for comparison, the great Isaiah scroll would actually encompass 2 full scrolls to take up all of the content of Isaiah the prophet's message. And so all 12 on one scroll, much more compact, concise messages that were delivered at different points in the history of Israel. As we begin to think about Jonah, one of the first things we note about Jonah is his background personally. We find out information about the prophets typically from the first verse in the prophet's book. We call that verse the superscription. And so really, superscription means something like above writing or something that's written before. And one of the questions is, did some editor perhaps come in and supply the superscriptions, or were they a part of each of the prophetic writings from the beginning? That's not completely clear. But when we look at those first elements, we can actually see some important information there. And I want to read the superscription from Jonah's message here just to connect with the information that it can give us and help us in understanding what he's sharing with us. And so the first verse in chapter 1 of Jonah reads, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying." And then of course we have God's word, this message that he's giving to Jonah the prophet. That first verse as the superscription includes typically, when we look at the prophetic corpus as a whole, typically it provides us 3 pieces of information. We have the prophet's name. We have something about the prophet's family, usually his father's name. And then most of the time we have the names of kings under whose reigns the prophet completed his ministry. In this case, however, we're missing that third component. We have Jonah, The word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. We have his father's name, but we don't have anything about the kings. But as we continue into the message in verse 2, we find the reason for that. God instructs Jonah, "Arise, go to Nineveh, the great city." And so what we find out here is Jonah's message is not directed to the people of Israel or the nation of Judah. It is, in fact, directed to the Assyrian Empire and one of its most important cities, the city of Nineveh. Now, as we begin to think about the importance of that for our understanding of the background of Jonah, it puts us at a slight disadvantage. Typically, if we have the name of a king, we're able to connect with the chronology and we're able to go into the dating of that king's reign and make some statements about what time frame we're dealing with. With the prophet Jonah, since we don't have the name of a king in Israel, since we don't even have a king from Assyria, we're left to try to figure out exactly what our chronological setting here is. We do get some help with Jonah, however, from a secondary text. There is a narrative text in the Hebrew Bible known as Kings. We divide in the English Bible into 1st and 2nd Kings. And so if we turn to 2nd Kings, chapter 14, we can actually see a reference to Jonah as an historical prophet. Beginning there, in the reign of Jeroboam II, we find these words that are written about Jonah the prophet. I'm reading from 2 Kings 14, verse 25. "He, being the king in that day, Jeroboam, restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the sea of Arba, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel." And here's the part that connects with us. "Which he spoke," that's the Lord, "through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet, who was of Gath-Hepher." And so this reference to Jonah from 2 Kings does help us, even though the superscription in the prophetic book does not give us information that helps us connect with chronology. We know it's Nineveh. We know it's the Assyrian Empire. We can get some general idea of about what time frame we're dealing with. But by going to 2 Kings, we can actually connect with the 8th century. And so as we see Jeroboam's reign, a reign, by the way, that was characterized by great prosperity in the northern kingdom of Israel. Perhaps the northern kingdom Israelites thought that God was pleased with them. Unfortunately, many of the prophets that speak in that context, particularly Hosea and Amos, will mention the fact that God is preparing an enemy to judge them during this time of prosperity and peace. And so in Jonah's case, he's actually prophesying here, at least in his general ministry as a prophet, in this time frame of the 8th century. It would seem fairly simple then to connect the book of Jonah with an 8th century background. Of course, one of the problems with that is when we look into the book, we find some issues that may dissuade us from making that connection directly. For example, critical scholars have suggested the book is much later in time, perhaps as late as the 5th century, written in the post-exilic period. And there are a number of reasons why scholars have pointed in this direction. One of the most unusual things about the book of Jonah is that it is unique among all of the prophetic literature of the Old Testament, in the sense that most of the prophetic books actually record the oracles of the prophet. In other words, the divine messages that were given to the prophet that he preached to whatever audience he was directed. In this case, Jonah's message is not a collection of his oracles. In fact, there's only one statement that the prophet makes in the entire book that we could consider an oracle. In chapter 3, God tells him to preach this message, "Yet 40 days, and the city of Nineveh will be overthrown." That's the only thing he preaches in the entire book. And so we find a little bit of discontinuity here with the other prophetic literature. There are no oracles of Jonah. What we have instead is a narrative, a story about Jonah. and about his call to take a message to the people of Nineveh, and unfortunately about how he turns away from that call and rejects God's command to take the message and begins to flee from the Lord. And so Jonah is a very unique book among the prophetic literature. That has led some critical scholars to suggest that the book is not in fact historical, that it was a story created at a later time about an historical prophet. In fact, some have suggested that whoever created this story found Jonah there in 2 Kings and was intrigued by the lack of any direct connection to his ministry, other than perhaps this prophecy that he makes about Jeroboam. And so perhaps they picked up Jonah from 2 Kings 14 and then created a story about him. Of course, if that's the case, then nothing in the book should be understood as historical, but more perhaps as a parable, something that was meant to teach an important lesson. Critical scholars will point to the idea that at the end of the book, and we'll come to this later in the series, but as Jonah is in this dialogue with God in chapter 4, and God is rebuking Jonah because he doesn't appear to have any compassion on the people of Nineveh, perhaps what this book really was meant to do in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, in that post-exilic setting, was to help Israel understand something they had not understood before. That God is actually concerned with other nations besides the nation of Israel, the people of Judah. Critical scholars will suggest that's a radical thought, something that has developed in terms of this progressive idea that the religion of Israel develops over time and they begin to understand things differently as time passes. Of course, it discounts, unfortunately, the reality that as far back as the book of Genesis, in the call of Abram, we have promises made to Abram that God is going to bless him, that he's going to be a blessing to others, but ultimately that in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. And so it seems that from the very beginning, the people that would eventually be called Israel were given a universal message to bless all the families of the earth, for God to work through this chosen people to accomplish His will on behalf of all nations. While critical scholars suggest this is a post-exilic book because of the fact that it's connected to this theme, God's concern for the nations, I would reject that idea and suggest, in fact, it is in concert with the larger testimony of Hebrew narrative. But in light of the fact that many critical scholars take that as an innovation in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, that in fact we have a much later composition. And so one of the big questions with the book of Jonah is, should we date the book to the 8th century when we have the historical figure Jonah doing his work of ministry, or should we connect it to the 5th century in the time of the post-exilic period and suggest perhaps a whole new way of looking at the world through the lens of God's plans for the people Israel? These are unique elements of the book of Jonah. And of course, the fact that it's a historical narrative rather than a collection of prophetic oracles seems to at least lend many scholars this idea. Other issues within the book that some scholars have pointed to suggest this is not a historical account, but really a story created, would be a couple of things along the lines. First of all, the size of the city when it's described in chapter 3, described as a 3 days walk. Some dispute over how to understand that, but according to archaeological discoveries, the city of Nineveh was not nearly as large as a 3 days walk would imply. And so again, some critical scholars say there's a historical inaccuracy here in this book. It seems to be an exaggeration of the size of the city. And so perhaps we're not dealing with something that's been meant to be taken historically. Perhaps the most famous example of what some would consider a parabolic element within the book of Jonah is in fact what God does with Jonah as he flees from the Lord. As we'll get into that material a little bit further along, but perhaps you're familiar with the story enough to know that when God calls Jonah, He says, "Arise, go to Nineveh," Jonah actually arises and flees before the Lord and makes his way to the furthest point on the face of the earth from the Lord's plan for him in Nineveh. That would be in Tarshish. And he goes and he contracts with some sailors to take this boat to Tarshish, and we believe he's making every effort to get away from God's call. Well, the interesting thing in that context is that eventually, and I like to say this many times in my classes, God's will be done. And so God is going to apprehend Jonah as he makes this effort to flee. And you may know the famous part of the story. A great storm has come on the sea. The sailors are trying to save themselves. Eventually they find out Jonah is responsible. His God is bringing judgment on him for his disobedience. And so Jonah is thrown into the sea. And of course God appoints a great fish to swallow him. Of course, in light of critical theory, many scholars would look at that element of the story and say, well, this is clearly not meant to be taken historical. It's fantastic. How could a person be swallowed by a fish, survive within the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and then be spit back out onto the land? And so that's led many critical scholars to suggest, again, we're dealing with a parable, a story that's written. And so when we bring all of these issues together, general consensus among critical scholars is Jonah is different. It stands out from the other prophetic literature. It's a narrative and not oracles of the prophet. It has some hyperbole, the exaggeration in the size of the city. It has a fantastic element in the fish that swallows Jonah. And of course, the whole element of Nineveh being the object of God's compassion is called into question. And so many scholars will reject the historicity of the text. From our perspective, we can make a couple of comments on these issues. First of all, in dealing with the unique nature of Jonah as narrative, here's an important element to note. Jonah is found in a collection of other prophetic literature. It's the 5th book among the 12 minor prophets. It begins with a superscription that follows the pattern that's established for the prophetic literature of the Old Testament. And we have no indication in the history of the study of the canon, that's the compilation of these books into an authoritative collection. We have no indication in that history that Jonah was ever disputed as a prophetic book. Just for comparison, we have a book in the English Old Testament canon of the prophets, namely Daniel. And Daniel, although having very many interesting elements, visions that he has, and a message that he's told to store up until the end times, we don't find the book of Daniel in the prophetic corpus of the Hebrew Bible. It's actually found in the last section of that material called the Ketuvim, the writings. And so there seems to be a recognition by those who were compiling the canon that although Daniel shares some elements with prophetic literature, even some visions that he has, even a message that he's given, it's not included in the prophetic corpus. On the other hand, Jonah, although primarily a historical narrative, is included in the book of the 12. And so in pointing that out, I think it's important to notice that, of course, those who were compiling the material, and we don't know exactly who that would have been, and we're not even sure exactly when it was done, we do have at least this sense. The number 12 is very significant in Israel's history. Of course, the 12 tribes of Israel. And so perhaps the number 12 is an important organizing element there in compiling this book of minor prophets. But we don't see the book of Jonah excluded from the prophetic literature because of the nature of its historical narrative. In terms of the city of Nineveh, certainly there are a couple of ways to look at the question of the size of Nineveh. Some scholars have pointed out that the 8th century is really a downtime for the Assyrian Empire, and perhaps we would expect a smaller iteration of this capital city. But it depends on how you read the idea of the 3 days walk. Some have suggested there's actually what we might call a greater Nineveh, perhaps in modern terms somewhat of suburbs around the larger city. We do have precedent in the ancient world and in the land of Israel for an upper city and a lower city. And so perhaps the reason that it's a 3 days walk is because it's more extensive than just the city proper. Another scholar has suggested, however, that as Jonah enters the city 1 day's walk, it doesn't necessarily mean a linear distance, but perhaps is best understood as him walking through the city in its different precincts and possibly looking for places where he can announce his message. In the ancient world, the gate of the city is often thought to be almost like the courthouse where official business is done. We see that referred to in other books of the Old Testament, for example, in Ruth, when Boaz goes to arrange this kinsman-redeemer marriage that he's going to undertake with Ruth. He goes to the gate of the city and brings together 10 elders to make it official. And so perhaps one of the reasons we talk about a 3 days walk is because Jonah is not walking in a line for 3 days, but in fact going from gate to gate in this larger city so that he can make this public proclamation, this announcement of his message. A second idea is perhaps within the city itself we have a couple of different temples. We know at least of the temple of Ishtar that's been found in this Assyrian context. We do believe there was an older temple, and there may have been some other places that were considered official worship sites. And so it's possible that he was not only making his way from gate to gate, he was making his way from worship site or temple to temple in sharing the proclamation. Either way, we don't have to consider the size of the city to be a problem when we have other ways of interpreting that issue and seeing Jonah and the time frame of the 3 days walk in that light. Another issue, of course, is the great fish. And understanding that from our perspective as evangelicals who believe that the Bible is inspired and in fact is the Word of God, we also believe that God Himself is the Creator and King of the universe. If we read Genesis 1 and we read it in light of the narrative and its claims, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That's a supernatural event. And so as we see God at work doing supernatural things in the Bible, we should not be surprised at all. In fact, God's power over creation is what delivers Israel in the first place from their bondage in Egypt. If you read carefully in the book of Exodus, it's God's power over creation that He uses in the plagues to disarm the Pharaoh and his armies and to accomplish this great work of redemption. And so we wouldn't necessarily be surprised to see a supernatural element like God appointing, and that's actually the word that's used in the Hebrew in chapter 2. God appoints a great fish. Later in chapter 4, He appoints a plant to grow, to give Jonah shade. He appoints a worm to cause that plant to wither. He appoints a sirocco, an east wind, to bring misery on Jonah as he's contemplating the rebuke that God's about to give him. And so we see several themes within the book where God's power over creation is shown. That would be certainly a supernatural component. And let me just note here, there are certainly natural laws we have discovered in modernity that govern the way the world works on a regular basis. But that does not circumvent the creator of those natural laws from stepping into time and space to accomplish His will in ways that are beyond nature. And so we're going to point to one more thing that I think helps us validate our understanding of the book of Jonah from the side of the fish as well as the historical nature of the book, and that is Jesus Himself. Jesus is asked for a sign. And as He's interacting with these religious leaders in His day, He says, "I'm not going to give you a sign, except for the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth." The sign of Jonah seems to be, in light of the story of Jonah, not a sign of burial, although Jesus mentions being in the heart of the earth. It seems to be a sign of resurrection. Because once Jonah has spent his time in the belly of the fish, he is spit out onto the land. And perhaps what we have here is an example of God rescuing Jonah from death, from the pit, from Sheol, and spitting him back out onto the land. And Jesus, referring to this same situation, says, just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish, so I will be in the heart of the earth. The implication being, well, I won't stay there. I'll be resurrected. And let me just say, as a Christian, although we're looking at this book in the Old Testament and we're looking at the Hebrew Bible and connections there, all of our readings must be read through the lens of the work of Christ as Christians. And so let me just say here, if you've got a problem with supernatural things, then you're going to have a problem with the most important event that took place in the history of our faith. The resurrection is what establishes who Jesus is, His identity as truly the Son of God, the divine King Himself, the Messiah, the promised one. And that resurrection vindicates Him, because again and again He's done things, He's done signs pointing to His identity, but He's been rejected by the leaders, the religious leaders of the day. He's been rejected by the Roman procurator. And it's in the resurrection that we find the vindication of His identity, because He had said to His disciples, in fact, as soon as Peter confessed Him as the Christ, He said, I'm going up to Jerusalem, and they're going to arrest me, and they're going to kill me. But 3 days later, I'll rise again. And so it's in that resurrection that we find the vindication of Jesus' identity. It would be hard for Christians to turn away from the testimony of the resurrection. But if we reject the supernatural, then unfortunately we're forced to turn away from that testimony in the resurrection. Let me mention one other item here in terms of the historicity of the book of Jonah. When Jesus mentions Jonah and the sign of Jonah to these religious leaders, He seems to assume very clearly that Jonah is not only a historical prophet, but that the account in the book of Jonah of what happened with Jonah and his time in the belly of the fish is in fact a historical reality. And so if we're going to take Jesus and His understanding of the text of Scripture into consideration, then we'd have to take into consideration His seeming claim, at least, that the story of Jonah is historical and in some ways forms a parallel with his own experiences in his death, burial, and resurrection. Finally, let's deal with the issue, and we've mentioned this briefly a little bit already, but let's deal with that issue of the question of whether Israel is developing in their understanding. Do they now just begin to realize that God is concerned about the other nations? I'll just mention very quickly here, that seems unlikely, particularly in light of Matthew's genealogy to begin his gospel. He mentions Canaanite women like Tamar, like Rahab. He mentions a Moabite woman like Ruth. He mentions the Hittite, Bathsheba, who had been Uriah the Hittite's wife. These are accounts that extend back much earlier than the stories that we find in the post-exilic setting. And so it seems that Matthew recognizes already an awareness that God was at work in what we might say foreign women, women who were not a part of the covenant nation, to accomplish His purposes. And therefore, this is not a revelation of new information. God is concerned about the nations. He always has been. In fact, we could even point out, as Paul does in Romans, that when Abram was called, he was in fact a Gentile. It was only after God made the covenant with him and gave him the sign of circumcision that we could begin to even think about that Jewish rite and that Jewish covenant people that eventually we will encounter. So these are some background issues that we want to cover, and hopefully this will help us better understand as we move forward in some of the episodes to come.